In this episode, I visit with podcaster Pat Cheung on his thoughts around the user experience in podcasting. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. Today, I'm thrilled to have with me Pat Cheung. I'm not quite sure how Pat and I met, but we did connect up, and it turns out he not only has a podcast, but he actually has some really interesting things in the podcast arena. So I asked him if he'd come on the pod, and he said, sure. So Pat, with that long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about your professional background and what your role in the podcasting world is?
Ooh, so there's short version and long version.
Long version.
All right, long version. So long version is I'm a UX designer by trade. So I've been in the software tech field for quite a while, basically a lifetime. And so in UX design, I build products, I create products, I run engineering teams. And I've co-founded a startup before that did pretty well. We got venture backed. It was in the healthcare field. And finally, we got acquired several years ago. And after we got acquired, I basically asked myself what I want to do next, as a lot of founders do. And kind of hopped around a little bit, to tell you the truth. And finally, I thought, what I really enjoy, and I've just always enjoyed podcasts from a very early year in the podcast universe. And I thought I wanted to do something in podcasting, solve some problems there.
And
and I eventually built this startup called PodInbox, which the problem I was trying to solve with PodInbox is I noticed a lot of the podcasters I was listening to wanted to hear back from their audience. And there was not a very sort of easy way to do it. So, I heard a lot of the podcasts I was listening to, tell their audience, in their call to action, say stuff like, record your audio message and email it to me. And I still hear people doing that now. And I'm like, there's got to be a better way of doing this. Or they would give out their personal phone numbers or Google phone numbers to leave voicemails. And I thought there might be a more fun and social way of doing it. Yeah, so that's how PodInbox was born.
Let me go back to your UX background because I find that incredibly fascinating. I come out of a legal/regulatory compliance world, and we don't meet a lot of UX folks. But when we do, they say, is this really how you communicate? Do you even think about the user experience? And we all go, no, why would we do that? And so I'm really intrigued that you took that professional background and looked at a completely different arena, a podcasting field, and say, hey, what's this like for the user? So could you tell me a little bit about that perspective and really how that lets you look at a situation and say, guys, if there's a better way to do this?
Sure, yeah. Kind of like the example I mentioned before, that I heard a lot of podcasters give their users or their audience or their fans, we use the word fans quite a bit, to tell them this call to action that was very convoluted. Like, I consider myself pretty technical, but some of these podcasters were saying, record an audio message, which isn't very straightforward for the average person. Like, I think as podcasters, we take it for granted how easy it is to record an audio message. But for someone else, like, they might not even know the program to go to on their computer or their device to record an audio message and then to email it. So the first version of PodInbox we came out with was just to solve that problem, right? Let's just give podcasters an easy way to create a page on the web to record and upload an audio message instantly. So we thought, that's a good first product. And also with user experience, right? Like, we were trying to be better than voicemail. Voicemail doesn't have any social proof, right? That's why a lot of people don't like leaving voicemails. They don't know what type of voicemail to leave. They get nervous recording because, with voicemail, a lot of times you got one shot, right? You got one shot to record a voicemail, and people who aren't used to talking into a mic or something, they get really nervous and they might, fumble the message or whatever. So in the user experience of our app, we let them preview the recording before they press submit. Something as simple as that. We consider well, when we say we, I guess me as user experience designer, I consider myself pretty considerate when it comes to thinking not only about our users who are podcasters, but about our users' fans, because eventually, that's what the podcaster wants to do, is to engage their fans, and we want to make it as easy as their fans to do that as possible.
That's really fascinating because I heard you really speak on multiple levels of the user experience. One is interaction back with a podcaster, but it's also as basic as audience engagement. How do you help a podcaster understand that, yeah, I can put out a podcast or you can put out a podcast, but that's about a tenth of the work because
Mm-hmm.
now you have to engage your audience. And do podcasters really understand that engagement part uh, and engage by simply more than listening?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of ways to engage. You can engage through social media, and I could go through, I have workshops around this that I don't want to talk about too much, but um, I mean, I'll just talk about some ways to engage, some common ways. So one way is social media, right? I think we, as PodInbox, and even me as a podcaster, I often say, that's a great way. If you have the propensity to do social, do it, but just know that you don't really own your audience. I think people who create audiences know that the best way to engage is the most direct way, like when you have their actual email addresses. So I'm a big believer in newsletters, collecting email addresses, collecting contact info, because then you're not going to be beholden to that platform, right? So one of the things I do a lot, I talk to a ton of podcasters, and I often ask this question, like, how much do you know your audience? And unfortunately, more times than not, a lot of people don't. They always kind of say, I'd love to hear back from them, but whether I don't have the time or I don't know how, that often comes up. So yeah, one of the things whenever I hear that, I'm like, oh, us, or me as a product designer, I have to make it a lot easier. I got to make it very easy for the podcaster to set this up, very easy for the fan to do this, and yeah, yeah. My primary job as a UX designer.
Um, but you go far beyond simply helping people understand social media, content creation, newsletters, and email lists. You've got your own podcast conference. Could you tell us a little bit about the genesis of that event and what you do in your annual conference?
Sure. So the conference is new. It's called PodConf. Anyone want to check it out? It's at podconf.com. And basically, I guess it sprung from the idea that, well, first, I guess just to scoot back a little bit. So I launched PodInbox about 2 years ago. I launched a podcast movement. So I love these big festivals. And there's a couple of big ones, of course, that we know. It's Podcast Movement and Podfest. I love those. I participate in those. And I've been a vendor in those as well. So I've had a booth at both these big conferences. But personally, I'm kind of a selfish guy, meaning I get pretty tired at these big conferences. Maybe because I have a booth, maybe because I'm a vendor, but also kind of maybe being a user experience designer, I also hear from other people that maybe they get a little bit tired too. So I think there's like a place where maybe a space in the industry where smaller conferences, podcast communities can thrive. So that's really where the idea was germinated. That it kind of came from this maybe a little bit of a selfish desire to have smaller conferences and even just be an attendee. Like I wouldn't, if I didn't create this one, I would love to be part of just being an attendee at these smaller conferences, because I really, when I go to these things, I value the connection. I kind of hear it time and time again that people, they might not go, listen to the speakers. They're really just kind of in the hallway because they want to connect, right? So, so that's how the idea germinated. That can we have these smaller sort of communities and conferences? I hate to even call it conference because it sounds so big. But can we have these smaller events where people just come together and collaborate and meet and get inspired from each other? So yeah, that's how the idea was born. And then I think it was December of last year. well, I guess just to go back a little bit more, I became very involved with my local podcast community here in Portland, Oregon. We have a meetup with about 1,000 members, which is pretty big, but that meetup kind of went defunct over the pandemic because obviously the pandemic kind of closed everything down, kept people from meeting. So I joined as an organizer of that 1,000 podcaster meetup group. I'd say about like 8 months ago or something. And my whole thought was, let me help reboot this community because it kind of went defunct. So I hosted a ton of happy hours, coffee meetups, things of that nature. And I thought, you know what? I think it's probably time to have something a little bit more formal, something like a one-day conference. And yeah, that's how it started.
So really, what struck me there, Pat, was you looked at it from a big conference down to a small one, but you also looked at it from a small meetup scaling up.
Mm.
And the first time you and I visited, we talked about my rural podcast conference network idea and how I was trying to see if I could develop a business model for a small rural area. And it strikes me that listening to you talk about creating PodCon, um, you're really taking a very big idea that we both attended, both Podcast Movement and Podfest Expo, and scaling it down to a local level. And just listening to you, it strikes me as there's an absolute market for that. Obviously in Portland, well, I shouldn't say obviously maybe, but in Portland, there's a ton of podcasters.
Mhm.
And it's a very vibrant podcasting community. The nearest big city to me is San Antonio, and there's a vibrant podcasting community there. And the same information that you and I would garner at a larger national event, there's subject matter experts in both Portland and in San Antonio who could give a 20, 30, 40-minute presentation. And you could put 3 or 4 of those together or even more and drive great value to a podcast community in a local town. So just listening to you describe that, it really strikes me as there's a lot of opportunity for professional growth in our field at the local level,
Mhm.
because people like you and I have subject matter expertise, perhaps in narrow areas, but nevertheless, areas that other podcasters can use. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think so when we developed PodConf, I kind of was actually riffing off another conference that I really love. It's called WDS, World Domination Summit. And they were driven by 3 core values. So I kind of stole that idea of having these 3 core values for us too. And our values are inspiration, connection, and participation. And just to focus on that last one a little bit, I think kind of what you're alluding to is participation. I think is one of the most interesting things, and of I guess one of the most interesting things and enjoyable things of building this conference is how do we get attendees to participate. And I think the other podcast conferences do a great job, but I think when you get to that size, the participation from the actual attendees become less, right? We and I don't want to say anything bad. I still love those conferences. I'm still going to participate and attend those other conferences, but I think the difference with this one is, that's why we wanted to make it a core value, is when you have smaller numbers like this, like I think we're only targeting about 100 to 150. There just leaves a lot more room for attendees to participate. So it is one of our core values, and to do that, we have these things called the attendee-led circles. So they're kind of like small meetups within the within the events. And I know the other events have that too, but I think with a big event, those become a little bit more the sideshow, whereas having attendees, actual podcasters teach each other, maybe like dare I say, the long tail of podcasters that are not as prevalent or big, share their learnings. I think that could be invaluable. And I think one of the things having a small conference is it lends itself for opportunities to let that happen a little bit more.
So the Um, could you tell us a little bit about the Portland podcasting community? Is it as broad and wide as I might suspect it is? And where do you fit in with your podcast? Tell us a little bit about the community you're a part of.
Sure. I think with community building, it's always sort of learning about the community. I mean, like I said, I've only become an organizer in this local community probably I'd say 8 months ago, 8 to 10 months ago. So I'm still learning about it. And it's funny what you said earlier that, there's a whole market for this. I would agree. I think there's a market for doing like a lot of these smaller conferences all over the country, but they are hard. Like I think I underestimated how hard it was to find the people in your city. And that did take a lot more effort than I thought. Like, for example, we have 1,000 people in our meetup group, right? But you know, when I was doing the happy hours, honestly, I think the pandemic really just took its toll because maybe 10 people would show up in every meeting of 1,000. That's like a very small percentage, right? Like 1%, less than 1%. So, I mean, it did take a lot more work than I thought to get to know who are the podcasters in the city. So, do I know who they are yet? And are they all over the place? I think now with this conference, I'm finally learning more that, wow, there's a lot of amazing podcasters in the city. So I think they exist, but I think, time will tell whether I get to know them more. But I think that's one of the joys I'm finally able to enjoy in producing this conference because we have I basically feature every attendee that wants to be featured on our website, so I'm getting to know a lot of them sort of on a little bit more personal level. And I'd say about like a quarter of the people decide to do a profile, but like now I'm really beginning to see, wow, there's some really interesting folks here, very interesting podcasters, people have hundreds of episodes, and yeah, excited to learn more about them, really.
Let me change the focus just a little bit to the metaverse and Web 3.0.
Hmm.
And I want to do that for a couple of reasons. I have studied this, once again, more from my legal/regulatory compliance hat. But the thing that has struck me about those concepts is it is largely to enhance the user experience. So an artist may create music, they may create artwork, they may create a visual story, and then they may create an NFT to help publicize it, and they may give their listeners or their fans some token that allows them some merch or some discount to some event. But it struck me that that's just a great way to have not only an engaged audience, but really a committed audience. Now, some might call that a fan, and anybody who's seeing the background of my podcast knows I'm a big fan of a lot of different things. But it struck me at its most basic, both of those two concepts are taking these overall concept of user experience and engagement to the next level. I was wondering if you looked at that or thought about that or have any thoughts on that one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean a little bit, probably less so from a metaverse NFT perspective, but I do think about the creator economy a lot. And one of the reasons is because PodInbox, we started with that simple feature of, hey, engage your fans by letting them leave a message. Quickly though, because we launched that podcast movement, and that's where I did a lot of research, talked to a lot of podcasters, try to understand their pain point and trying to understand what they're trying to do to engage their fans. Of course, monetization kept on coming up, right? So we dove into that very hard. So not only can your fans leave a message on your PodInbox page now, they could also leave donations and buy things and stuff like that. So we're pretty deep into the monetization game, and we're going to get deeper. So on that level, I have thought about it a lot. I think about podcasters who do this for a living, whether it's a side hobby, making a little bit of extra money, or just enough to justify some of the time and the bills, or people who are literally doing it as their primary income, we kind of range the gamut of thinking about those types of users. So, I know there's a long-winded answer to your question, but like when it comes to metaverse and NFT, I think people are excited about, NFT could mean many, many things to different people, right? But for some people, it just means, like you said, like membership and access to things. So you see like elite clubs, offer an NFT to verify, I guess, membership into a club. And with that membership, like you alluded to, they get benefits and stuff like that. So we haven't thought about that from a NFT perspective, but we are thinking of membership quite a bit, right? One of the, I guess if I'll call them quote unquote competitors, if you will, right? They're huge. They're $1 billion company, but we think about being an alternate solution for Patreon. From a podcaster's perspective, we hear some complaints, right? I think it's a great platform for creators in general, but I think for podcasters specifically, they're looking to solve these, very specific problems around membership. And I think, when I think about membership, I think that's a great way to monetize a podcast. I think loyal fans want to be part of a club. They want, some benefits of membership, and maybe they just want to support the podcaster, right? They just want to support the show that they love. And, all too often I hear podcasters, the first thing they think of when they think of monetization is what? Sponsorship, right? It's like the first word that kind of comes out. And I've even been on monetization panels where, we talked, 90% of the time about sponsorship. And then last 10 minutes, it's like, oh, what about, fan donations? It's almost like a sideline, but, I have a different thesis on that. I think, for the long tail of podcasters, that could be a great first way to monetize. And even for, when you study the people who are doing it at a high level with millions of downloads, they're also doing fan engagement too, fan donations, tips, and stuff like that. So, sorry, long-winded answer, but I think when I think of the NFT scenario you're thinking of, I do think maybe in the future. I think it's still too early. Once again, from the usability standpoint, I think a lot of people, when NFTs were hot, like last year, or maybe the year before, they're like, how are you going to incorporate, crypto and NFT or blockchain into your app? I'm like, right now, I'm not. Right? It's just too far away from the fan experience. The fan just wants to donate a couple bucks, or like, subscribe to memberships. That's a couple bucks a month. I don't think they have the wherewithal to, create a wallet, and all this under the context that I'm a crypto guy myself personally. I do, partake in some of these things personally, but I think when it comes from the user's perspective, I think we're still some years off from it.
Pat, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself, any of your commercial enterprises, or really any of the topics we've touched on today, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Sure. I would say, yeah, if you're a podcaster, go check out PodInbox. I think it's a cool platform, and we are working pretty fast on developing a ton of features. That's PodInbox.com. And if you're in Portland or plan to be in Portland on April 29th, and if this episode airs before then, go check out podconf.com. Register.
Well, Pat, this has been a great visit. I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I greatly look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate having me.
This is Tom Fox. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Fox on Compliance. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Fox on Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.